So last week your topic was about emotion control. And the first part of the handout there was talking about volume control. So kind of learning how we react to certain emotions and how we can, one, identify them and also manage those feelings, and kind of learn to develop more of a volume control. And also learning that feelings aren't the enemy, they're just feelings, they just are. Did anyone, was anyone able to go through that and recognize maybe areas where they could improve on certain emotions that they had? Or did anything in particular pop up from the workbook that you were surprised at? Okay. So we also in the handbook, or sorry, the handbook, the workbook, we also talked a little bit about that idea of disconnection. So when we tend to experience overwhelming emotions, that can lead to sometimes disconnecting or dissociating, is what we call it in a clinical term. So things like being spaced out, feeling numb, kind of daydreaming, that outside of body feeling, feeling really confused, an avoidance, escaping, all those kind of things. And I'm curious if anyone relates to that idea of avoidance or that dissociation or the kind of disconnect maybe from your feelings when you do notice that you feel something really overwhelming. Okay. So when we have those kind of overwhelming emotions that come up, where we do tend to get that dissociated feeling, that out of body sensation, it's really important to counteract that through grounding, which is another part of the workbook that we handed out last week. Um, it helps to bring you back into the present, because again, that out of body feeling, it almost, I kind of tend to describe it to clients as you're kind of looking at yourself from above, and you're watching yourself act and do things, but you don't really feel associated with it or really have any connection to what's happening in your body. So staying grounded is something that can be really helpful in managing that experience, because when we disconnect, when we disassociate, we're not present to what's happening, and we're not able to react in a way that is using, I guess, maybe more helpful coping skills. So you're actually just reacting to the emotions, and you're just kind of, it's just happening to you rather than actually being an active participant in it. So that idea of grounding, warning signs for those, I think the biggest part about dissociation is actually just not being aware of when it's happening, and having to tune into that and realize, okay, well, how do I? Usually it just happens. I'm feeling something, and then instantly I'm dissociated, and there's not really much time in between to be able to check yourself and realize what's going on. So some of the things that might be helpful in terms of being able to become more aware of that is there's usually physical warning signs there. So tension in the body, anxiety, tightness in your chest, maybe difficulties breathing, a sense of blurred vision or numbness in certain body parts, dizziness, headache, a floating sensation. So tuning into your body is going to be really important in recognizing your emotions, and also recognizing when you might be disconnecting, so that you're able to cope with that, manage it, and figure out how to fix that, or to ground yourself and come back into the moment. So there's some steps to grounding, which is that you have to make a conscious decision to stay grounded, and make the conscious decision to say, hey, I want to do this work and I want to feel these feelings. Because again, the part of the reason why we disconnect is that we don't want to feel our feelings, because they are overwhelming and they feel too big. So if you decide and you make a conscious choice to stay grounded and to work through those feelings, then you're going to be able to, or better be able to, stay in that moment and do that. Learning your own personal warning signs. So again, I listed a few physical symptoms earlier, but your symptoms could be much different, right? You could have it could be an emotional sensation. It could be something completely different than physical. So just making sure you're tuned into that and tuned into your body and yourself. And so that you know yourself enough to be able to know that warning sign and be able to pick up on it more quickly when it does happen. Making a list of grounding skills to try and carrying this list with you can actually be a great way to help yourself stay grounded. So you have an actual physical thing to turn to if you start to feel those warning signs and start to feel that discomfort, that you can kind of look at and remind yourself, because in that moment you're probably not able to plan ahead or to rationally think through things. Your rational brain is probably shut off at that moment. So having something where you can just read through it and just go into it without having to really do much thought is going to be really helpful too. Practicing these skills is really important as well. So making sure that you're being active in the process of learning these skills to be better at managing those moments of disconnection or feelings of overwhelm. When you don't practice and when you just hope to use the coping skill in that moment, it can be really hard to see the positive effect of it if it's not being practiced long enough. So we kind of recommend practicing even when you're already feeling grounded or already feeling kind of more at a neutral state, because when you're practicing those things, when you are at a more calm and level and even place, it's going to be easier to practice it. You're going to have more time and patience for it. And then it's going to become easier to practice it in big moments as well. Excuse me. Another part of grounding could be journaling. This journaling and writing in general, I like to say it takes everything from out in here that can be jumbled and confusing, and it really kind of puts it out and lays it out for you. And this can be helpful in maybe even understanding what your triggers are, or what your warning signs are. And it can help again with processing how you need to ground yourself, or what you need in those moments. So it can be really helpful to reflect on that a little bit more. Some different grounding techniques would be holding a stone or an object. So having maybe a grounding stone, or like I said, any object. It could be a piece of fabric. It could be really anything you'd like. But that can, again, when we tune into our physical sensations, we're able to bring ourselves back into the moment, and that can be really grounding. Breathing really deeply, switching your body position, or moving to a different place in the room, or switching chairs. That can be another way to kind of snap you back into the moment. Light stretching can be helpful. Tighten and relax your body parts. So muscle tension and then release can be really helpful. Speaking up, so talking about the feeling or maybe the topic that's causing that sense of overwhelm, that can be difficult in the moment, but it also might be really helpful. Listen to what other people are saying. Drinking water can be helpful. Move your feet on the ground. Knitting, writing, painting, walking, exercising, visualizing, using visualization techniques to imagine yourself getting rid of or setting aside that overwhelming emotion or memory so that you're able to cope with it better. Let's see. Journaling, like we just mentioned, can be really helpful. Practicing some mindfulness activities or meditation, things like that. Positive affirmations can be really helpful. So there's tons of different options there. And lastly, we spoke a little bit about that idea of being a puffer or a shrinker. So when we feel threatened as people, we usually people have two approaches, especially if they've experienced adversity in their lives. You either become a puffer, so you get big, maybe you get loud, maybe you yell, maybe you react more strongly. Or you can be a shrinker. So you kind of turn inward, you become shut down, you become quiet, and you go inside, you make yourself small. So knowing how you respond, especially in regard to overwhelming feelings, again, can be helpful in developing more of an awareness of what's going on for you. Again, these responses might have a place in your life in the sense of how has that helped you? How is that responsive, whether you puff up or whether you shrink down? How has that helped you cope with those feelings that you've been feeling? Is there a reason why you do that? And can you pinpoint that idea? It's also helpful to be reflective of maybe how that response, whether it be puffing up or shrinking down, has become a barrier in your life and has actually kept you from being able to kind of engage in the world and engage with other people in a healthy way. Just a lot of reflective things this week in terms of emotions and how we cope. Did anyone have any questions about the workbook or have any thoughts or comments about that before we dive into our topic today? Okay, so I'm just going to get the presentation up. Just give me a sec to pull it up here and get us all set up, and then we'll get started. Okay. So as usual, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll be keeping track of that as we go along today. Oopsies. All right. Okay. So today we're talking about this idea of loss, and then we're also talking about the sense of future as well. So we're going to start with loss. So loss is what happens, and grief is what is felt. So how do you know if someone is grieving? Typically, responses are crying or feeling depressed or showing signs of depression, feeling sad. An inability to eat can be often a sign of that. Withdrawing from people, isolation, feeling tired all the time, a sense of irritability. So these are all associated with the feeling of grief or grieving. What are feelings associated with losses? And what happens if we don't let ourselves grieve? If we don't let ourselves have those painful but normal feelings? Sometimes physical symptoms can arise if we don't allow ourselves to grieve in appropriate ways. Anger can come up, violence towards ourselves, violence towards others, feeling numb, chronic depression, inability to experience pleasure and have fun. There could be a preoccupation with death or a really big fear of death. Being unable to get those losses out of your head. And sometimes using substances excessively to cope with the overwhelming feelings that come along with grief. Many people tend to ask, if the outcome of not grieving is so bad for us and leads to so many, I guess, issues or consequences, then why don't we let ourselves grieve? Why do we have a hard time with grief and going through that process? Grieving means feeling some of the most distressing feelings that a human can experience all at once. And so if we can understand that some of us, based on our own experiences and based on our past and our history, struggle to experience overwhelming emotions and tend to experience those things more often, then this is a really difficult time. It's not a fun thing to go through, to feel those overwhelming feelings, and grieving brings out some of the most distressing feelings that we can experience in our lives. We may avoid grieving because we have the notion that, I'll get over it, or we might have been told that time heals all wounds. I have to get on with my life, with my job, with my role. Things like I have to get a grip. So I'm sure many of us can relate to some maybe toxic, not so helpful, invalidating things that people tell us when we're grieving or trying to get over something. That ends up making us feel even worse about our situation and maybe how we're dealing with it. It's really important to be kind to yourself through self-care and compassion. It's okay to let people take care of you too when you're going through a loss or going through grief. It's not a failure on your part that you're grieving. This is pain and feeling pain and suffering is a universal thing that we all go through. So it's not a failure on your part or a shortcoming, that you feel these things and you feel them deeply. So loss of an opportunity, person, experience, or object can generate painful emotions. And we need to be able to safely acknowledge and experience these emotions in order to move through the loss. It can be helpful to shift your attention to things that are less overwhelming first in order to learn a process that you might choose to use with other losses. Remember that life is filled with experiences of letting go in order to move on. A simple example of this is we have to let go of today in order to move in tomorrow. And that is a process that we don't really think about on a day-to-day basis. It just kind of happens to us. But that is a process of letting go in a simple form. Letting go means remembering the loss, but that the loss is no longer determining the future. Letting go means letting go of the pain of the loss that dominates the person or dominates us. When we're unaware of this idea, we can quickly become confused on what it means, what makes up our sense of self. Knowing what we believe, what we feel, what our preferences are, and what our own memories around the losses are. So overwhelming experiences, whether they're occupational or personal, can leave us often trying to please other people and being accommodating to what others want without necessarily thinking about what we want or what we believe. And these can become risk factors in developing vicarious trauma. So similar, an example, I guess, of this would be like a chameleon. So sometimes it can be helpful to be a combination of many different colors. However, you also need to know your own color, as you tend to fluctuate in different roles based on your beliefs, what you perceive others need from you, or to which they tell you that they need from you. You need to know the color that defines you. You need to know yourself to be safe in relationships and situations. So when we don't know our own color, this can lead to problems or, again, feelings of overwhelm. So when we begin to have questions or confusion around who we are, and then subsequently we might develop that need to accommodate others, what do you feel are some things that could change the outcome of this accommodation and prevent you from losing yourself in those moments? Anyone have any thoughts on that? What would it feel like for you to say to somebody else who's asking something of you, to say, no, I'm actually really not that color? Or maybe you actually say, yes, I am that color some of the time, but not all of the time. So I guess what we're getting at here is that the question of what happens when you stop changing colors for other people. How do you manage the guilt that might come from not accommodating others or not changing your color to accommodate somebody else or to fit into a different mold? How would that feel? And does that lead to a sense of guilt? So the process of letting go is also finding ways to grow through the loss. With that said, it's really helpful to be aware of the habits we create in instances to which we subconsciously do not give ourselves permission to let go. So what is a habit? It's a reoccurrent, often unconscious pattern of behavior that is acquired through frequent repetition. Our human tendency to make habits is normal. We all have habits. We all have things that we do on a regular basis, and maybe, again, things that unconsciously have developed over time that we don't even really think about because it's just so natural for us. But this can also be a way that we resist changing for the better. Our habits can kind of hold us in certain patterns and keep us in certain places in our lives because it's easier to kind of go to that automatic place than it is to be conscious and take that mental energy to choose a different pattern. We need to also be mindful around the process of a habit. Remember that we do it automatically without thought, which is why it's easier for us. In order to change, it means having to give something up and something that we're comfortable thinking, feeling, or doing. And we do that in order to so that we can think, feel, or do something new. So that process of having to give something up in order to gain something different or something new can be really challenging. And that can be where maybe people get stuck, because it's hard to let go of something that we're so habitually used to kind of, whether it be a thought, a feeling, or an action. It's really hard to let go of those things or decide to do something new because it serves us in some way. Has anyone needed to give up something in order to change an unhelpful habit in the past? And what did you gain when you changed that unhelpful habit in the past? I guess I have an example here. I used to be an avid pop drinker. I would drink, it was like my treat at the end of a long day. And I used to have a can a day. um, and that was something that I wanted to change, but it was difficult to give that up, because again, it was a reward for me. It kind of, odd way brought me joy or made me feel happy. So I had to give up that little moment of kind of happiness in order to gain a more healthy habit, I guess, in terms of kind of being more conscious about what I'm drinking, and again, drinking maybe more water instead of pop. So it's a small idea, but I guess I still had to give something up in order to gain a more healthy habit. And that can be a really hard thing to do. So as human beings, we have a really natural sense of discomfort that lingers around change and the unknown. Ironically, change is inevitable, and the unknown is the essence of change. But yet we still become really, really uncomfortable with the idea of change. And again, the idea of the unknown and not really knowing what to expect right now. Especially in this pandemic, right? That's brought up a whole bunch of uncertainty and change for everyone. And I think that's the reason why it has been such a struggle for many of us, because it did bring on such huge change, and very quickly did things change. And then we're continuing to change kind of every day. And we're back in that sense of it is changing still, right? We're kind of starting to enter into a new normal, and that's been good, but also brings up a lot of change and uncertainty about how things are going to look moving forward. So given that discomfort, and at times fear that everyone has of changing, in addition to particular barriers that individuals who experience various forms of trauma encounter, it's important to recognize that none of us change all at once. Instead, there's actually stages of change, and understanding where you are or where someone else is in that process of change can really help us be more compassionate with ourselves and with others. And this can help us navigate through the challenges that change can bring up. So there are essentially 5 stages of change, with an inevitable visit of a few bumps in the road as well. So the first stage is called pre-contemplation. So this is usually where we are not yet acknowledging that there is an unhelpful behavior that needs to be changed. You may be unaware of it. You may have positive beliefs about the behavior, or unhelpful beliefs about a helpful change. So being self-compassionate, or ignorance is bliss. There's the second stage is contemplation. So acknowledging that there is a problem, but you're not necessarily ready yet or sure of wanting to make a change. So you're kind of sitting on the fence there. The next stage is called preparation. So this is getting ready to make that change. And essentially you're testing the water. So you're starting to think about it. It's almost like dipping your toes in if you're at the beach or at any body of water, right? You dip your toe in just to see if it feels okay, and if you want to then kind of dive into it. The next stage is action. So actually changing the behavior that you're looking to change. And then we also have maintenance, which involves maintaining that behavioral change over time. So after all of the other stages have been completed, then you enter into that maintenance phase where you're starting to maintain the change that you've created in your life. We also, as I talked about earlier, there can be bumps in the road. So a bump could look like returning to old behaviors, or kind of having a slip up. Bumps in the road can happen in between any of the other stages, and it usually does happen in the process of change. It's unlikely that when you're trying to change a habit that you're not going to have a bump or not going to have a moment where you return to an old habit, and that's a normal part of the process. I think a lot of people can get stuck in those bumps and feel as though if they experience a bump, then they all their hard work has gone to waste, and there's no point in keeping going, and you already failed, I think is a word that might come up oftentimes when we experience a bump. And so this can lead to just kind of abandoning the whole idea of change in the first place. So when you think about change that you've already made in your life, what were the factors that helped you make that change happen? How did you overcome your fears of change in order to take the steps to make that change? Does anyone have any ideas for that or you want to share? So a key part to change is to let go of fear. You can't change your destination overnight, but you can change your direction overnight. So again, we have to, it's kind of, instead of deciding to change all at once and kind of be at that end state right from the beginning, it's a process. It takes time. It takes effort. And again, there are going to be bumps in the road that might deter us or make us feel like we're not doing enough, or that we are failing or not able to make that change. It makes us doubt ourselves in our ability to make the change. But again, that's just a normal part of the process, and it's just part of learning something new and making a change that you want to make. Okay. So we are moving on to that sense of future. So people who experience various forms of trauma, including vicarious trauma, can develop a difficulty to envision the future because the past has such a hold on them. The future is going to happen whether we like it or not, and the future is inevitable as long as we are alive. But when we have experiences of trauma or adversity, it can be really difficult to imagine getting to the future because we're held in the past because of what we've gone through. The question is, how much say do you want to have in the outcome, right? Again, if we're living in the past, or maybe not living in the past, but stuck in that, as we mentioned, the future is inevitable. We're always moving forward, whether we like it or not. So if you're experiencing that sense of being stuck there in the past or in your experiences, then you're not really having a say over what's happening in the future because you're not present to what's going on moving forward. Do you believe in that the future is something that you can actively choose and that you can design? Some of us may say, well, I'm doing things one step at a time, one foot in front of the other. But this can sometimes lead to walking in a circle or not really taking any steps forward because again, it's scary, and taking steps forward, again, sometimes requires change. And that can be really difficult. So if we're constantly in the state of, well, I'm doing one step at a time, and not to say that you have to rush yourself, but I think you have to have a purpose in that one step. There has to be maybe more of a direction of that. So one step at a time is not enough. Like we said, you have to have a direction, and this direction has to match your vision. And without a vision, you don't really know where to point and where to kind of, I guess, where do you point your feet? Where do you start taking steps towards? If you don't have a vision of that, then you're just kind of walking aimlessly without really any direction. So you need to know what it is that you're looking, what's your end goal, what's your end point. So as we just mentioned in losses and about change, we need to acknowledge how change happens. So as we talked about the stages earlier, there's a little poem that's called Autobiography in 5 short chapters, and it really outlines this process of change. Some of you may have heard this already, but the first stanza goes, "I walk down the street, there is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I'm lost, I'm helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Have any of you ever found yourself in a situation like this, feeling really lost and helpless? So the next stanza, stanza 2, says, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I am in the same place. But it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Has anyone ever found themselves in a situation like this, trying to fool ourselves that we don't see the problem, and when you're in it, you can't believe that you're in the same place again? So stanza 3, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. So has anyone ever found themselves in a situation like this where, you know there's what the problem is, but now you've developed a little bit of a habit about it, and it's really hard to imagine changing it or to want to change it? So stanza 4, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. So has anyone ever found themselves in a situation like this where you saw the problem coming and you successfully got around it, but you were still kind of flirting on the edge of danger there, where you could have kind of easily tipped into maybe old patterns or old habits? So stanza 5 is I walk down a different street. So what do you think it really means to walk down a different street? Just because it is a different street doesn't mean that it has no holes, but it doesn't mean that you won't fall into the same hole that you have made a choice to try something new. Setbacks are not so much that we have taken steps back as we have perhaps met old habits and familiar feelings in new circumstances. This is why self-compassion, while participating and practicing vicarious resilience, is important in the work that we do, as well as the roles that we play personally. So now that we've reviewed that process of change again, through that little poem, what do you think is the most important, most critical moment of the change process? And which stanzas do you feel that was reflected in? So the most important piece and the most critical moments are the change that happens between stanza 2 and stanza 3. And this is because that's when the person becomes aware that there is a pattern here, that there is a habit there that's forming. I'm sure many of us can relate to the idea of recognizing somebody else's unhelpful habits or destructive patterns before the person recognizes their own patterns in themselves. Why do we think, can we hypothesize, why is it so hard for us to see our own patterns and acknowledge our own unhelpful behaviors? Oftentimes the way that we become able to see our own patterns is frequently through the help of other people. If we only can open up our minds and hear what people have to say as helpful, rather than take it personally or take it as a criticism, this can really help us in, again, acknowledging maybe where we have some work to do, or maybe some of the patterns that might not be helpful for us. But only by seeing our own patterns do we become able to make a different choice. And once we notice our patterns, and once we make the decision that we want to make a change on those, then we have to summon up the courage to move ahead and make that different choice. So first we have to walk around that hole, and then we have to decide to walk down a totally different street. So creating a healthy future is about being willing to walk down that different street and not just kind of teeter on the edge of walking around the hole and potentially falling in. We have to decide to completely abandon that and go down a totally different street. So self-fulfilling prophecies can get us into trouble and keep things from changing, or can prevent trouble and helping us create a better future. One way that self-fulfilling prophecies can get us into trouble is when we are unaware of how common it is for people to make assumptions about each other automatically, based on race, religion, age, gender, manner of dress, speech content, professional background, etc., etc., etc. So the expectations we have of others or of a situation often determines how we behave in that situation, and then the other person reacts to us and what we're emitting. The outcome is a product of this interaction. So our own expectations, and then how that person reacts to the energy, or I guess, or those expectations that we're bringing into the situation. What are some common assumptions that you have perhaps made about other people, or that have been made about you in your professional role, or even in your own personal lives? Does anyone want to share an assumption that people have made about you in the past? Again, in your professional role or as a person in general? Okay. If we go into a situation expecting something bad to happen, and we react as if something bad were to happen, the other person picks up on our cues and responds as if something bad were going to happen as well. And this outcome is likely to be something bad that happens. So thus this proves our expectations were correct. So we've created in this moment a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have caused something to become true because we expected it to come true. So other times things do come true because they just do. However, oftentimes, especially when dealing with interpersonal relationships and interactions, how we perceive the situation plays a significant role in determining its outcome, simply based upon the cues or the vibe or the energy, the nonverbals that humans pick up as part of understanding and interacting with other people through that nonverbal communication. Different people are likely to react in different ways, depending on who they are, their previous experiences, who the other person is, what the situation is. Some people become aggressive and really angry. Others will become avoidant and may feel numb. Some might cry or become very upset, and others may become apologetic. So to summarize the steps of an unhelpful self-fulfilling prophecy, we have the first step being you adopt unhelpful beliefs about the other person's intentions, styles, or behaviors. You react to these expectations or assumptions by conveying some kind of disapproval, possibly through what you say directly, but more likely through a look or a body signal. The next step is the other person then sees your reaction, and what do? They're likely to become fearful that you are going to hurt them, and so they act self-protectively and get defensive, or they share in your fear, disapproval, or whatever your reaction was conveying to them. The third step is talking about what do we see? When this happens, when this interaction plays out, you see them acting, the other person acting defensively. You probably get angry and aggressive or fearful, and you might take it to heart and get more defensive and self-protective. So the outcome is likely to be whatever expectations you had of the other person or of the situation, and these are confirmed through again, having that person react self-protectively or get defensive, and then you end up getting defensive because of the way that they're acting. And this, again, confirms what we thought about the situation in the first place. In fact, expectations seem to make things come true. That is what a self-fulfilling prophecy means. You predict something happened, or something will happen because you predict that, and because of predicting that, you actually end up making that come true inadvertently. So how do you think we could change these unhelpful self-fulfilling prophecies into maybe positive self-fulfilling prophecies? How could we alter our expectations in each situation? What could we do differently in every situation? Where and how might we change this script so that it comes out differently in the end? So some useful things to do to prevent the automatic spiraling of self-fulfilling prophecies include checking out the bias of your initial assumptions about someone else. Do you have any facts that support those assumptions? Or could it just be a bias on your part based on your own personal experiences and opinions? So it's really important here to, when you notice an assumption, when you notice maybe a judgment, to question that and say, what are the facts that I have to back that up or back that belief up? Is this because I have facts, or is this based on my own experiences and my own opinions, or maybe something that's happened to me in the past? If there are other people around in this moment or this experience, do they have any facts that might help you know more about the situation? What will happen if you just give the other person the benefit of the doubt and assume something positive about them? How do you think that might change your expectations, your reactions, and then their reactions? Quite frequently, self-fulfilling prophecies keep people stuck. It keeps them unable to grow or change in a relationship with another person. And if we deliberately change our expectations and we choose to have a positive attitude, we can turn unhelpful situations into positive self-fulfilling prophecies. So again, that idea of giving people the benefit of the doubt, I think that one's an important one. And maybe to question yourself a little bit more when you take something personally, like, why is it that I'm taking it personal? Is this based on one instance? Is this based on a whole series of instances that make you have the assumption? What personal experiences that you've had in the past are coming up in this moment or have been similar to this moment that may be adding to the emotions that are coming up or the reaction that you are having? So being curious about these things can really be helpful in adjusting our own biases and our own assumptions and expectations, so that we are able to kind of turn maybe unhelpful self-fulfilling prophecies into something that might be more helpful for us and actually benefit our relationships. So as healthcare professionals and frontline workers, it can be significantly helpful to recognize loss and an opportunity for growth. It provides us with opportunities to become leaders, to bring up the kind of emotions like glad, that balance out all the mad, sad, and scared feelings that are associated with painful life experiences and current adversities. To help provide a pathway for working through loss. And it can also give us the opportunity to guide us into a healthier and more sustaining future. So our last question of the evening, or reflective thought, is, what was the single most difficult thing you ever had to do, but that you did successfully? Does anyone have an answer for that one? Okay. So that's what we have for us today. Does anyone have any takeaways from today? Any comments or questions that they'd like to have answered? Like I said at the beginning, the handout for this week in the workbook is in the chat. The link is there. So if you'd like to grab that, you can take a look at the information that we've put in that workbook and kind of reflect on it a little bit further.